Amber Rosner recently wrote an essay for Time titled "A Media Looking for Mistakes," portrayed Jimmy Carter as a failure. It's time to look deeper. She's also the author of the book Jimmy Carter and the Birth of the Marathon Media Campaign.
Amber is a professor at the University of Tennessee Knoxville School of Journalism and Electronic Media, and she joins us now. Amber, thanks for being with us.
Certainly, it's an honor to be here today.
You know, most people talk about it's this narrative of the presidency was a failure, the post-presidency was a huge success. Is that narrative wrong?
Well, I think a lot of modern historians and biographers would say so. It's certainly the cultural shorthand that became popular in the immediate aftermath of former President Carter's term in office, particularly for the ways in which that last year was overshadowed by crises, both domestic and international. You had tremendous stagflation, endless gas lines, and then most prominently, the Iranian hostage crisis. All of those elements served to overshadow Carter's successes in office.
And what led to that? I've heard historians say that maybe he just didn't understand Iran. What led to that conflict for him and the way he handled it?
You know, it's interesting because I think it was really important for him to make certain that no matter what, that the hostages were freed without any harm to them. And he wanted to undertake that through diplomatic means. So he didn't want to engage in a military conflict around it. And so that became the most important element to him from a policy standpoint, from a position standpoint. That said, what was happening around him was that you were seeing saturation news coverage. And so he actually suspended all of his reelection efforts because he felt like it would be disrespectful to be on the campaign trail while that crisis was unfolding. And ultimately, it became the subject of day-to-day news coverage. Walter Cronkite famously starting the trend of saying day one. And so by the end, ultimately, the anniversary coverage of the Iranian hostage crisis came to overshadow even election night coverage. And, you know, after the failed attempt to rescue the hostages in 1980, in April of 1980, he was seen as a weak president.
Well, you met President Carter in 2014 when you were writing your book. What surprised you about him in person?
Well, first of all, I think that I was really appreciative of the personal kindness that he showed me. And it's been amazing to hear the tributes in recent days and even in recent years, because my experience with him aligns with that of so many others, average citizens across the country. I was really impressed with the kindness that he showed me. He told me that he loved my first book, which was about the history of baseball journalism. He, of course, was an avid baseball fan, and so he was really focused on putting me at ease.
Amber, this is Paul. I wanted to bring you back domestically and talk about the economy for a moment. We know coming out of the Ford administration, the attack on the economy, the way to handle it was to wear buttons that said "Win inflation now, win." I'm sort of curious because obviously that was part of Carter's difficulty as well. Yet he was a brilliant man, intellectually brilliant man. Did he not understand the facets of the economy to impact inflation, or does it go to show that he and perhaps any president really doesn't have the role, the power to impact the economy in a meaningful way from that chair, if that makes sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. You know, it's interesting because presidents often get saddled with the economic circumstances of the administration prior to them. And that certainly was the case, I think, for former President Carter. He encountered significant inflation while also seeing unemployment numbers rise drastically. And that was in part related to rising gas prices after he struck the Middle East peace accords, and that particular deal. And so, I think it's unfair to him to say that he didn't understand economic circumstances, the economic landscape. I think he was certainly one of our most well-read presidents. He had a keen understanding of both domestic and foreign policy. I think that it's more accurate to say that often whomever is in office gets saddled with the unfortunate realities of the economy.
Your book was about the birth of the Marathon media campaign that started with Carter. Why was that? What happened there?
Well, I mean, certainly it wasn't just related to former President Carter. He was actually just the best to harness news media coverage of what was referred to in the time as the Invisible Campaign. So what you were seeing happen as news media outlets began to concentrate more and more attention on the Iowa caucus and those early primaries is that political actors felt the need to announce their candidacies even earlier and earlier, and essentially to engage in unofficial campaign activities as early as 2 years before a general election campaign. And the news media was focusing more and more attention on that. And what Carter and his advisors did so effectively was to really harness and embrace the news media coverage of those early moments. And the news media coverage of those early moments emphasized that he was an underdog victor, which was, of course, so particularly salient in the mid-70s. Think about the movie Rocky. That was the most popular movie of that era. And Jimmy Carter was the preeminent underdog victor in American politics.
We're looking at live pictures here. The hearse containing the body of President Jimmy Carter has just pulled up to the Washington National Cathedral. The service is set to begin in just about 20 minutes. In the meantime, Amber, before we let you go, maybe you can talk a little bit about how did the press shift into this adversarial mode with the presidents at the start of the Carter campaign? Was that when it all shifted, or was it long before that?
Well, I mean, certainly I think that the press had moved into a more investigative mode around Vietnam and Watergate, and those moments of scandal, those moments in which presidents weren't being completely honest with the American public. Certainly in terms of the treatment of Jimmy Carter, they actually hailed former President Carter as something of a media genius for the ways in which he was able to navigate the trail in the 1976 presidential election. But you're right, they did actually engage in these almost investigative exposés around his background. They wanted to be really certain that they understood the man. And then certainly he encountered the glare of, media exposés even before the end of his first 100 days.
I think we're looking at the family coming out here and making their way into the cathedral as we await the start of the service at 9 o'clock this morning.
Amber, there's so much talk about the post-presidency of Jimmy Carter. I'm sort of curious. He knew that there was a view of his presidency as not being the most successful. He talked about it in interviews. I'm sort of curious. To me, the post-presidency actions, the building of homes and all of that, do you think that was a response of Carter to that image to change things, or was that the man himself, regardless of how successful his presidency would have been?
Yeah, I mean, from my vantage point, it doesn't seem like it was a strategic attempt to engage in image repair. I think that instead, that after his term in office ended, that he came back to Plains, Georgia, and that both he and his closest political advisor and friend and love, Rosalynn Carter, thought very deeply about the ways in which they could continue to make an impact on their community and beyond. And so I think for them, their efforts with establishing the Carter Center in 1982 to eradicate the disease ways to keep the peace and to promote free and fair elections around the world was a natural extension, honestly, of their faith and the ways that they wanted to engage in public service.
But he also, by the way, in those protecting elections around the world, he angered some of his successors in office. They weren't happy about some of those moves.
Yeah, I actually was just talking to a reporter about that just yesterday. Of course, all of those post-presidents will be in the room in just a few moments, and many of them did have a very complicated relationship with former President Jimmy Carter, most notably, I think, former President Bill Clinton, for the ways in which he continued to engage around the world.
What lessons did President Biden learn from Jimmy Carter's presidency?
That's a really good question. Well, first of all, I think that they had a very deep friendship over the years. One, of course, with, as some of the news coverage in the past couple of days has noted, with some wrinkles. So famously, President Biden, he had considered a run for office in 1980 against the sitting president, Jimmy Carter, at the time. I think he was concerned with, some of the ways in which former President Carter was engaging on the campaign trail, his moralistic tendencies. But overall, I think that they were deep political allies. And they were both, of course, political underdogs. What did President Biden learned from Jimmy Carter? I think that he learned to, engage in what is referred to as the politics of authenticity in order to kind of speak most credibly to the American public. I think that he also, like Carter, is a man of incredible integrity and character. And I think he attempted to govern in that way.
You're watching the live coverage here, if you're just joining us, of the hearse of Jimmy Carter pulling up to the Washington National Cathedral. We're waiting a service to start in just about 15 minutes, and lots of dignitaries lined up inside, Paul.
And of course, Amber, there's a lot of memories of the peace accords that Carter held. They said it couldn't be done between Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. Technically, that agreement lives today, right? A lot of stress and strife in the Middle East, but Carter did something at that time nobody thought could ever be accomplished.
It did. He struck a fragile peace, right? And I think that we're seeing that fragility today. One of the ways that he engaged and was able to accomplish that, though, was through personal diplomacy, which he was a master at. And, he especially emphasized to both of those important world leaders the ways in which that particular accord could create an atmosphere, a climate of peace that their children and grandchildren might benefit from.
Yeah, you talk about personal relationships. I understand he actually developed a pretty good relationship with President Ford afterwards. Is that true?
That is definitely true. I think that both men had great respect for each other, even though, of course, on the campaign trail, they were kind of the ultimate adversaries. And I think that was also true to an extent of former President Ronald Reagan, who, of course, was there to, in 1982, to offer words of tribute at the opening of the Carter Center in Atlanta.
In an essay you wrote for Time on the death of Jimmy Carter, you pulled a quote that he made at the National Press Club when he announced his candidacy for president. He simply said, "I'm a farmer, an engineer, a businessman, a planner, a scientist, a governor, and a Christian." Noteworthy how he introduced himself?
Oh, I think so, certainly so. I also think it contributed to the understanding of the press that he was a bit of an enigma. But I think that his introduction speaks to what some would say were the contradictions in his life.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because, this just popped into my head. There are all these quirky stories associated with Jimmy Carter, the rabbit story, the UFO story. He's done a lot of living, considering he's only spent 12 years in public office, right? He's done all these things, as Robin said, and I'm not sure why he runs into all these quirky stories, Amber.
Well, I mean, certainly the rabbit story lives on in our memory in part because of the frustration of Washington-based press with Carter's presidency at that moment in time in 1979. Just to clarify for your readers, the rabbit story is in the spring of 1979, former President Carter was fishing on a small pond in Georgia, and a swamp rabbit attempted to attack his canoe, and he tried to beat the rabbit back with a paddle. And that summer, it was kind of a moment in which there wasn't a lot of national press, and it was a story that one of his press aides shared with an AP reporter, Brooks Jackson. And it was a little bit of a footnote in Brooks Jackson's coverage, but then suddenly it got so much airplay. And in part, it was because it was a moment in time in which Carter's administration was seen as collapsing, and it became the perfect metaphor, I think, for a failing administration.
Rabbits can become scary, I think, is
Yeah.
what. Amber, I'm sort of curious that we haven't talked about President Obama and that relationship as well. There's an interesting picture of 5 former presidents, for George H.W. Bush and Carter there as well, where you see Jimmy Carter standing at a distance from the other presidents. That goes back to my question earlier about their relationships. But he also had a complicated, it's funny, Larry talks about the good relationship with Republican predecessors. Talk about Obama, because that was more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that Obama's relationship with Carter, he kept Carter at a distance. And he was actually just engaged in the common political wisdom of the day. Because, of course, after Carter loses the election in 1980, it really does become the political wisdom that he's something of a pariah for any candidate in the party. And so the idea, the common wisdom was you embraced what had become his Democratic primary blueprint to run for office, but you distanced yourself from the man individually while you were on the campaign trail. And I think that remained true for some sitting presidents as they didn't know necessarily how deeply he would engage in the world global landscape. And so I think that certainly was former President Obama's strategy for engaging with Carter.
Among the speakers today, 3 of his grandsons will be speaking. Joshua Carter, Jason Carter, and James Carter. Talk about any of the family's legacy with the Carter Center and any of their involvement in politics and with his legacy with his family.
Yeah, well, I think the most notable is likely Jason Carter, who, of course, was kind of along the way as a toddler when Carter ran for president in 1976. He was a baby at that time. But, I think for all of his children and his grandchildren, that Carter really imprinted upon them the importance of giving back to their communities and beyond as public servants. And I think that that's certainly what we've seen from individuals like Jason, who's become a bit of the family spokesperson as Carter's health started to decline over the past decade. I think that it will be interesting to see if they continue on a path to a future political careers based in that example of former President Carter.
And Amber, it's interesting. You mentioned, I'm fascinated by your phrase that Carter's seen as a pariah of the party back in the 1980 or so, which reminds me, of course, of even Ted Kennedy. Right? I mean, here's a Kennedy who challenged him and began to take him on. But as we see now, Republicans and Democrats who are praising the life of Jimmy Carter, I have a sense as somebody who watches history that this is not just because this is the funeral of Jimmy Carter. I have a sense this is a permanent kind of revision of the view of him going forward.
Yeah, well, I think that certainly everyone can agree that he became president based in the promise never to tell a lie, to offer a government as good as the American people, and that he honored that he was a man of tremendous character and integrity at an incredibly important moment in our history. I've compared him to the glue that held our country together in the aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate. And I think that there's a common consensus around that now. And I think that what we might see in the coming days, weeks, months, and years ahead is a bit of a reevaluating of his presidency, but also of a reevaluating of what it means to have a successful presidency.
Yeah. It seems like we're in an age of career politicians. He did not seem to be that type. Why did he want to become a politician?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that he gets his start in the local school board. So it really does seem to be that he is attempting to apply his talents and to take a line from his first biography to why not the best, right? To offer back himself to his community. And then I think that famously in the 1972 presidential cycle, he had a lot of people coming through the state of Georgia, and he was like, if these people could be president, why not me?
Yeah.
Like, I think he saw that he had the talent to engage in that sphere, and that he could offer something really important to the American public and to the globe in that moment.
We're looking at some people arriving among the family. We see President-elect Donald Trump, his wife Melania, former President Barack Obama coming in. You see Al Gore, Mike Pence, everyone shaking hands there. And as they sit down, you see an interesting conversation probably happening there between Barack Obama and Donald Trump.
It was interesting to note initially that when President Obama came in, he went right to Al Gore. They'd had a warm exchange. He did a quick handshake with incoming President Trump, but now they're sitting and they are having a conversation as former President George W. Bush enters.
Amber, we thank you for joining us. Again, Amber is a professor at the University of Tennessee and author of the book Jimmy Carter and the Birth of the Marathon Media Campaign. Amber, thanks for being with us.
Of course, thank you.
Thank you.
We see former President